Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Former Soviet Union leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who oversaw the end of the Soviet Empire, has died at the age of 91. Today we're going to be in conversation about the life and times of Mikhail Gorbachev. My guest for this is historian Ronald Suny. Ronald Suny specializes in Russian history. He is the William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History and Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan. He's the author of a number of books, including Red Flag Wounded, Stalinism and the Fate of the Soviet Experiment, Stalin, Passage to Revolution, which he's joined us in the past to talk about, and They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else, a history of the Armenian Genocide. Professor Suny, a very good morning to you, sir.
Very happy to be here with you again.
I suspect when we talk about the life and times of an important political figure, somebody like Mikhail Gorbachev, we're also going to be talking, it's also a history of the Soviet Union and I guess Russia even itself. It's important to remember he lived another 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union.
That's right. Yes. It's sad that his tenure in office was so short, only 6 years, and then he had to watch basically the disintegration of his project. So Gorbachev, of course, was a great democratizer. He was a Democrat and a democratizer, genuinely democratic. I think his successors, both Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin, were not genuinely democratic. But he had to oversee not only the collapse of the country and the failure of his own project to build a kind of democratic socialism in the Soviet Union, but also to see democracy turn into what we have today, a kind of centralized, corrupt, oligarchic, and now militaristic authoritarianism.
Tell me more about this project that you speak of, that you called a failed project.
Gorbachev had two words he used over and over again. One was perestroika, the other was glasnost, and both of them have come into the English language. Perestroika means restructuring, rebuilding, and it was a project, in his own words, to turn a centralized, top-down, bureaucratic, relatively stagnating economic and political system dominated by a single party, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, into a democratic state. And part of Perestroika ultimately was to turn an empire, the Soviet Union, into a federation of relatively egalitarian, relatively equal national republics, the 15 republics of the Soviet Union. And that was an enormous project, that democratization, you could call it decolonization of the largest state in the world. And then glasnost, which means sort of opening or publicity, sometimes they translate it as, that's a bad translation, means the end of censorship, the opening of free expression, the allowing of the people to write and talk and meet freely. So this was an enormous project. And if that weren't enough, okay, so we've got two things going here: democratization of the state, de-imperialization of the empire. But let's add to that ending the Cold War, ending the rivalry with the United States and the West, right? And trying to create what he called a single international community from the Atlantic to the Pacific, something like that, right? So ending the alliances of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, ending the Cold War. If that weren't enough, then also it was the liberation of Eastern Europe, the retreat of the Soviet army from Afghanistan. And let's add one more thing to that: the marketization, the liberalization of the economy of the Soviet Union from a top-down command economy into something more cooperative. So all of this was packaged under a kind of Leninist umbrella, meaning that he wanted to return to the kind of socialism that he believed Lenin had intended early in the Soviet period. More participatory, less bureaucratic, more a matter of the initiative of ordinary people. And that, of course, he never achieved.
So his goal, he would say this, but as you lay this out, it becomes more clear to me. His goal was never to bring an end to the Soviet Union.
Just the opposite. No, he wanted to preserve the Soviet Union, but he wanted to turn it from this a remnant of Stalinism and even Brezhnevism. That is a centralized, top-down economy and political order, undemocratic, into something more like a social democratic system. And that was incredibly ambitious. And remember, the major alternative to democratic socialism would have been, at the moment of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, what we now call illiberal authoritarianism or neoliberal economics. That is, the market can do everything, the state should stay away, end welfare and things like that. So he was proposing a kind of middle road between old Soviet top-down state socialism and the neoliberal capitalism that was then raging and is still, by the way, dominant in the world today.
Can you tell me more about his thoughts concerning Lenin and how that worked out? And do you see that? I mean, do you think he was right about how he was interpreting Lenin's
That's a very good question, because his hero was Lenin. So he was rejecting Stalin. You know, both of his grandfathers had been arrested and imprisoned during Stalin's time, and they weren't killed, but they suffered enormously. So Gorbachev, who grew up under Stalin, right, he in fact experienced that and rejected that terrible terror-dominated system. And his hero, he was Lenin. He thought Lenin had a vision, a humanitarian, humanistic, democratic vision of socialism. Now, it's not the way it actually occurred. After all, the Leninist Party, the Bolsheviks, the communists came to power in October 1917 and immediately participated in not only foreign intervention, but a domestic civil war. And the result of that war was the building of a very strong, centralized one-party state. And Lenin is responsible for those choices that led to that one-party state, as well as the exigencies and necessities of a moment of economic collapse, starvation, as well as civil war and foreign intervention. So the way Gorbachev saw Lenin was in his original intentions, which were more democratic in his view, and secondly, the kind of period of what we call NEP, or the New Economic Policy. And that NEP was the policy of Lenin from 1921, when the Civil War ended, to roughly 1928, when Stalin completely took over and established, again, this 5-year plan, top-down command economy, and destroyed the markets that NEP had fostered. So the period of NEP was, I think, best characterized as state capitalism. So there were markets, there was foreign trade dominated by the state, but there was also the peasants, the great majority, 80% of the population, were in charge of agriculture. They paid a tax to the state in grain or whatever they were producing, but basically they ran agriculture. That's what Stalin destroyed. So I think that Gorbachev, in his vagueness, and he's not very consistent here, and he's not very clear about his blueprint for what the future would be. That's one of the legacies also, and one of the faults that he had. He didn't really know where he was going. He thought things would work out somehow. He always talked about how they would all work out. Well, it didn't work out. But that was what he was looking for, something more democratic, more participatory, more productive. But of course, we know that by destroying the old system, without having the bricks, mortars, and beams to build a new system, everything collapsed.
Today, many people, late yesterday, when this news broke about Gorbachev's death, are going to be talking about Mikhail Gorbachev. I think a lot of the talk is going to be about the failure of the Soviet Union, and I think we'll probably talk about that as well. What was striking to me, though, and something I thought about when I saw about, he was born in 1931. He was born to a peasant family. And this really stood out to me, and how remarkable it must have been, considering before the Russian Revolution, you have, 300 plus years of a monarchy, of a Romanov control of more ancient Russia. And for somebody who came from a family of peasants to be able to rise to the top actually did seem pretty remarkable to me. especially when you think about this deeper history of Russia.
Americans are very proud that presidents like Lincoln and others came from a log cabin. Well, you have that experience in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was an upwardly mobile society. And the people who came to power, let's say after the Lenin generation, those folks were intellectuals, professional revolutionaries. Lenin himself was actually technically an aristocrat, a nobleman. But after that, people like Stalin, who was, after all, very poor and was classified as a peasant, though his father was actually a shoemaker, a cobbler. The next generation, under Stalin and after Stalin, were from the lower classes. So it's not unusual that someone in this upwardly mobile society, a talented, bright, ambitious person like Gorbachev, coming out of the southern provinces of Russia, could, through his abilities, through education as a lawyer in Moscow University, eventually making his way up the party apparatus, locally, provincially, could somehow catch the eye of central bosses like Yuri Andropov, who then plucked him out of the provinces, brought him to Moscow, and started his career up there.
You mentioned his grandfathers, if not one, but maybe both, were arrested during Stalin's regime. Did this affect Gorbachev? And last time we had you on, we talked about Stalin, and we also talked about the effect internationally, especially on the global left, that the fallout between, say, Stalin and Trotsky would have on the rest of the world. But that's internationally. I don't know if that's how that plays out within the Soviet Union. It might have been a bit harder to do that in the Soviet Union, considering the consequences of it. I mean, Trotsky got killed all the way in Mexico. So, so is that a dynamic that you'd still find in the Soviet Union? And tell me more about, I guess Gorbachev would join the government during Khrushchev, who would take over after Stalin's years. But maybe a little more about Gorbachev and his feelings towards Stalin, if he ever really expressed them.
We have evidence that he was, first of all, a very loyal communist. That is, he believed in the system. But because of the experience of his family and growing up down the southern part of Russia, he understood not only the way Stalinism was working locally, how poor, impoverished, and oppressed, really, the people around him were, but he also went through the war. That is, Nazis occupied his home province, and therefore he experienced that as well. And then the liberation of that province by the Soviet army. So all of those experiences, and his own upward mobility through the ranks, imprinted themselves on Gorbachev. So he basically believed in socialism, but he believed in a much more open, democratic, liberalized, you might say, socialism, one that he hoped would have been realized during the Khrushchev period after Stalin's death, but ultimately wasn't, until he himself, with the help of people like Edward Shevardnadze and Alexander Yakovlev and other reformers, tried to implement in the middle and late 1980s. So that experience is important. We know, for instance, that as a young as law student at the university in Moscow, Gorbachev criticized the anti-Semitic policies of the last Stalin years. That was very courageous to do that in an atmosphere of terror and repression. So we see here an extraordinary figure who did take risks through his career, but always appeared to his comrades to be a loyal communist, an able person who could get things done, an effective leader, and therefore he was promoted. Once he was selected for the top position, the general secretary of the Communist Party, one of the older communists, the former foreign minister, actually said, "Oh, well, he has a nice smile, but he has iron teeth." Well, the smile was true. It turned out the iron teeth weren't. That Gorbachev was a very, I would say, gentleman. He was a person who had great sympathy and empathy for others. And ultimately, he would be unwilling to use the force, the power of the army and the police to keep his own country together. The way I put it in one of my articles was he was no Abraham Lincoln. Now think of Abraham Lincoln, also like Gorbachev, a very decent man, a democratic leader, genuinely democratic. And yet Abraham Lincoln, when threatened with the dissolution of the Union, used power, used the army, declared war, and fought to keep the Union together. Gorbachev ultimately didn't resort to that kind of violence. He was afraid that those kinds of repressive or violent means, undemocratic means, would taint, if not eliminate, the democratic ends and aims that he so cherished.
I'm going to come back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in a moment. But first, I want to ask you about the position of General Secretary of the Communist Party. How powerful of a position is this? And is this a position that is forged during the reign of Stalin? My understanding of Stalin is the early years after he takes over, after the death of Vladimir Lenin, he's not just this completely one authoritarian leader who's in charge of everything, that this would take a period of time to occur.
That's exactly right. So the position that he was given, the secretaryship, general secretary of the party, was a bureaucratic position. But Stalin very skillfully managed to make it into the most powerful position in the country. And by the late 1920s and certainly into the 1930s, he was invincible. He could not be challenged. And he used that position to launch the Great Terror of the 1930s, in which, get this statistic, in 1 year, 1937, 1938, 700,000 people were shot.
And the pretext of this is sort of what were terrorist attacks that occurred prior.
The pretext, yeah, but these were fake pretexts, right? There were no real terrorist attacks. There were some minor oppositions within the party. Nothing really threatened Stalin. So they invented these conspiracies of Nazis and Trotskyists and Zinovievites and so forth to launch these purges and purge the party of any opposition to Stalin. So that by the end of the 1930s and through the war years of early 1940s, Stalin was absolutely an autocrat, a true autocrat. And that remained until he died in 1953. And then the Soviet Union, under Khrushchev particularly, began to loosen up a little bit and try something called collective leadership. Well, ultimately that didn't work out. Khrushchev became first among equals, and Brezhnev and the others continued that. So the position of the general secretary, by the time Gorbachev came to power, was one in which he had the dominant position, and others could argue with him. They could dispute, but ultimately they all gave in. And he did not ultimately use that power to its full extent. He certainly did not resort to using the forces of violence or the forces of order like the army and the secret police, except on very, very occasional moments to keep order and keep the Union together.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation about the life and times of Mikhail Gorbachev, who has died at the age of 91. Our guest is Ronald Suny. He is the William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History at the University of Michigan. His specialty is on Russian history. When Gorbachev, how does he get to the position of General Secretary of the Communist Party?
Well, as I mentioned, the General Secretary at a certain point in 1982 was Yuri Andropov. He had been head of the KGB. It was a powerful figure, and he was slightly interested in reform. He actually wanted to change the Soviet Union, make it more productive. And so he brought Gorbachev to the center, to Moscow, and put him in charge of agriculture, actually. And so that was the big moment of his career. And Andropov became ill very quickly and died in 1984. Now, when he died, he had made it clear to his subordinates that he wanted Gorbachev, this young man in his early 50s, that was young because everyone else was in their 70s, if not older, to be his successor. But the old timers in the party outmaneuvered Gorbachev at that moment, and they selected a doddering figure named Chernenko. And Chernenko only lasted a year. And then when finally he died, the Politburo decided, okay, we need someone younger. I said at one point at a radio interview at the time, it's good that they found someone in Gorbachev, at least, who could think on his feet, because Chernenko had been unable even to speak very clearly. And then he
was in ill health.
Yeah, I thought not only think on his feet, but stand on his feet. And ultimately, Gorbachev was that person. So the party was ready to try something new, but they had no idea how radical Gorbachev would become.
You mentioned the Politburo. I think is a term that many of us recognize, but maybe not fully understand. What was the Politburo?
So the larger kind of legislative body in the party is called the Central Committee. And the Central Committee ostensibly then elects a smaller group that meets more regularly called the Political Bureau or Politburo. And that was a small body. Now, in the Soviet Union, what happened was not power going up through the party to the top. Rather, it turned around the other way. It's the general secretary who dominated the Politburo. It's the members of the Politburo who dominated the Central Committee, and orders went downward rather than upward. So that was the body, 9 members, 11 members, whatever it was at different times, that really ran the country. So it was a kind of oligarchy, but one man, Gorbachev in this case, Brezhnev earlier, Stalin even earlier, Khrushchev in between, those men dominated the political system.
Coming back to the reforms that Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to institute, both Perestroika, again, which I think roughly means reform with the political system itself, and then also Glasnost, which means openness, political and religious, including political and religious openness. Was he alone within the Politburo or within the government of the Soviet Union in pushing these, or did he have a groundswell of support? And was there a movement even outside, I guess, of the government?
The West often thought of the Soviet Union as a very dynamic, revolutionary, left-wing country. In fact, those of us who studied it and traveled there in those years knew it was a deeply conservative society, right? When I first went there in the 1960s, think about what was going on in America in the 1960s, right? Protests, hippies, drugs, free sex, all this kind of stuff.
Civil rights.
Right? And civil rights. Yes, I should mention civil rights along with free sex. Anyway, all of those things were what characterized the 60s. I went to the Soviet Union. There was none of that stuff, right? This was like some backwater place. The Soviet Union was very conservative. And the elite, the ruling elite, was the most conservative. They wanted to preserve the system and change as little as possible. After all, they had privileged positions within that system. And along comes Gorbachev, and he wants to shake things up. So he met resistance from his own Communist Party. Now, it should be mentioned, there was no revolution from below at first. There was no groundswell of interest in this reform. Gorbachev had only a few people close to him who were also interested in this kind of reform. So he had to push it through the party. He had to get rid of a lot of those older communists in the Politburo and try to put his own men into those positions. And eventually there was a reforming element that developed. And as he opened up society, then more democratic forces began to appear among the intellectuals, among people in some of the large cities, in Moscow. Boris Yeltsin, who became the nemesis and major opponent of Gorbachev, appeared and led, I think rather opportunistically, suddenly he converted from communist to radical Democrat, led many of those forces. And then in the national republics, people began to express discontents. In a place like Armenia, Armenians wanted to unite with the Armenian-dominated province in Karabakh, which was in the neighboring Republic of Azerbaijan. So things began to develop. There was a ferment from below. But basically, the system was weakened at the top because the reforms were very radical. Gorbachev was unwilling to use the force, the muscle he had at hand to control things. And also, he sort of lost his way. And he would repeatedly say, I don't know where we're going. I don't know what I can do now. As he saw Yeltsin grow in popularity, as things get out of hand in many of the republics.
Why is Yeltsin growing in popularity? What's happening at this time? I guess this is towards the late 80s?
Late 80s, more in, like 1990 and 1991. So 1989 to 1991, the last couple of years of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin was a populist. Yeltsin had charisma. He was a great big figure, and he portrayed himself as a Democrat, a man of the people. And Gorbachev was an old apparatchik. He was an old Communist Party boss. He had a touch with the people at first, but as policies began to fail, as the economy worsened, people shifted, at least in some of the big cities and in the republics, toward the Democrats, toward the nationalists, toward people like Yeltsin. And Gorbachev was confused by this. He didn't understand how Yeltsin's charisma worked, but his own had failed. And he even says at one point, this man wants to be a czar, and the people seem to love him. He was confused by all this. In other words, Yeltsin understood the advantages and the opportunities offered by the opening of the public sphere, by this new democratic possibility. And Gorbachev was still working through the Communist Party and through the state. But Gorbachev was also doing something else. Because the Communist Party, or at least the majority of it, was so conservative, he was weakening the Communist Party as well. So he was undermining the party. He ultimately allowed elections for other parties to participate. And by doing that, in a way, as head of the party, he was actually sawing off the branch, the Communist Party, on which he was sitting. That was his instrument. And yet he was weakening it. In other words, Gorbachev wanted to be both Pope, that is head of the Communist Party, and Martin Luther, the great reformer. And ultimately, he was pulled apart by that. As conservatives went one way, in August 1991, they would carry out a coup against Gorbachev. And the more radical forces, the Democrats, the Yeltsinites, and the nationalists in the republics would go the other way and undermine Gorbachev from the left.
It sounds like a real lesson in political science. And of course, you are a political scientist.
That kind of ersatz
and how power works, though. I mean, it's pretty fascinating.
Absolutely, absolutely. You got to be realistic when you describe politics. You know, everyone looks for morality and so forth, but politics is absolutely infected by hypocrisy, by opportunism, by careerism, by venality, all of those things. Now, in the Soviet case, you had one person at least, that is Mikhail Gorbachev, who was so decent and so genuinely democratic that he neglected to use the actual instruments of power that could have maybe early on controlled the situation. And once it got out of hand, and once people were massively in the streets, he was unwilling to use that force to bring things under control.
Reading the New York Times obituary on Mikhail Gorbachev, it said that Gorbachev is somebody who is widely loved around the world internationally, but remembered in a much more complicated way within Russia itself.
That's exactly right. But think about it. Gorbachev's foreign policy was détentiste, or cooperation with the West. He initiated the talks with Reagan to reduce nuclear arms, and he wanted to go further than Reagan was even willing ultimately. He ended the Cold War. He liberated the countries of Eastern Europe, and he allowed the unification of the two German states that had been divided since 1945. But think about it. He was making all kinds of concessions to the West, and the West was not really helping him very much. He needed money. He needed financing. The economy was in shambles in the Soviet Union. The Germans did help. They sent billions at the time they were marks to Russia in order to buy the unification of Germany. Gorbachev hoped that the United States would also help. And though George H.W. Bush made promises, they never came through. They never did financially, to any great extent at all, help the Gorbachev regime to survive. And Gorbachev made concessions.
Is that because the West actually didn't want it to survive? Or the United States didn't want it to survive?
The United States actually wanted it to survive. That's the irony. The United States policy, at least George H.W. Bush's policy, was to preserve the Soviet Union. Remember his famous Chicken Kiev speech, where he said, don't revolt too much, help Gorbachev. He liked Gorbachev, and he wanted Gorbachev to succeed. He was afraid of the breakup of the Soviet Union, and yet they didn't really help. And what the Bush administration, this is the older Bush administration, wanted was a unified Germany inside NATO with nuclear weapons and American troops, but the withdrawal of Soviet troops. And vaguely, his Secretary of State, James Baker, told Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. And Gorbachev thought that was a firm promise. It was never in writing. And now the Americans and many scholars are backtracking on that it was never really intended. But the promise was made initially. And of course, ultimately, with the fall of the Warsaw Pact, NATO would find a new mission, accede to the demands of many East European countries, and would expand to the east, all the way into the former Soviet Union. The Baltic republics would become part of NATO, and promises to Ukraine and Georgia that they could join NATO. And we know today that this is what made Putin extremely angry. And we're now in the situation where we have open warfare in Ukraine.
It's interesting in history. We oftentimes say the fall of an empire. Rome fell in 476 AD, or the Republic fell, before that, and we put a specific date and time on it. And when you go back and look at it, people at that time didn't necessarily see it that way. Is there a specific moment in which the Soviet Union fell, and what exactly did that mean?
The Soviet Union was weakening, disintegrating in the years from 1989 to 1991. The official end of the Soviet Union was Christmas Day, December 25th, 1991, when Gorbachev resigned and the flag came down above the Kremlin. And then you had 15 independent republics and some kind of vague, weak, ineffective commonwealth of states, which, of course, was ultimately meaningless. But you could say, in a way, that though people at the time in 1991 thought the Soviet Union had disintegrated and unraveled rather peacefully, that it kept unraveling, and that it's still unraveling today in the war in Ukraine. Now, after the fall of the Soviet Union officially, you still had the Karabakh crisis, the war between now two independent states, Armenia and Azerbaijan, and tens of thousands of people died there. You still had frozen conflicts and civil wars in places like Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which were part of Georgia, or the Transnistria, which was part of Moldova. You had a civil war in Tajikistan, one of the Central Asian republics that, of course, no one in the West really remembers, or very few remember, and 50,000 people died there. So the end of the Soviet Union was tragic. And, that Putin famously said it's the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of our time. I'd certainly say it was one of them. That is, if the Soviet Union had held together, if it had become more democratic, we might have avoided many of these tragedies and the authoritarianism that's developed in both the former Soviet republics and in Eastern Europe.
And of course, it was a very tough time for people in proper Russia as well, economically, and in the years to follow. And hence, probably part of the reason why Gorbachev has a complicated, along with Yeltsin and others, have a complicated place in history for them.
Absolutely. So the economy collapsed. people were in long breadlines and not doing well in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. And that continued into the 1990s under Yeltsin. But, and there was a real collapse in the economy in 1996. Eventually, Yeltsin, always remember this, it was Yeltsin who appointed Vladimir Putin to succeed him as president. And then Putin was very lucky. Putin not only clamped down on Chechnya and, to the great support of most Russians, ended that terrible war in that North Caucasian republic, but oil prices globally began to rise. And Putin and Russia then did rather well economically in the early Putin years. So he gained enormous popularity. And of course, the interest of Russians in a freer country, in a wealthier country, in a more democratic country still existed, right? And Putin himself in his early years did open up to the West. But he felt, you can then argue, is this true or not? He felt the West turned its back on Russia. It did not help Russia significantly. It tried to push Russia down as a superpower. And therefore, he ultimately turned against the West and talked, as he does now, about some special Eurasian civilization or special Russian civilization, which is different from and superior to the West.
Is that rooted in history?
Everything is rooted in history, of course. History is the only database we have in order to understand the present and to try to predict what might happen in the future. So if you go back into Russian history, you can find lots of examples of autocracy, oligarchy, and repression and terror. You can find people like the Slavophiles or religious conservatives in the late 19th century who proposed that Russia was a special civilization superior to the West. You can find that in the great writer Fyodor Dostoevsky, for instance. All of those things exist. But at the same time, you can find the opposite. You can find Marxism, you can find Lenin's views, you can find social democratic views, which predicted that Russia would outdo the West in another way. It would get to socialism first. And that was considered in the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century to be the most progressive thing that one could imagine. You have instances, lots of people in the West will say, oh, Russia just has a natural tendency toward autocracy. They like being slaves. They like strong men as leaders, as if Americans don't like strong men for leaders. They prefer weak men, right? Yeah. So you can find instances in Russian history over and over again of popular resistance to tyranny, to autocracy. You can find revolutions in which ordinary people came out on the streets hoping for a more democratic or a socialist way of life in 1905, in 1917, in 1991 as well. But then elites, well-positioned elites, went their own way. The Bolsheviks took over and they formed a one-party state. Or Yeltsin launched the army against his own parliament in 1993 and established a strong presidency, even though he wasn't particularly strong. He was alcoholic and had heart conditions. But it was that strong presidency that Yeltsin made that ultimately Putin inhabited. And that's what we have today.
And that's the irony of what Yeltsin did. It was, I don't know about today, but for many years later, it would be a symbol of almost, freedom and democracy when he was with those tanks outside the parliament. But the reality was quite the opposite, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And the West loved it. And many scholars and pundits and journalists in the West applauded Yeltsin, even when he sent the tanks in 1993 against his own elected parliament, because they were afraid that communists might return to power. So they supported this rather violent coup d'etat against the parliament and hoped that a new constitution would lead us toward democracy. But it didn't. It led ultimately to Putin and what we have today.
How would you describe Mikhail Gorbachev in these years, in the years following after the downfall of the Soviet Union? Was he a person who was speaking publicly about the politics that would come to follow?
Occasionally he spoke publicly, but not very loudly. And there are rumors, there are stories, there are interviews sometimes that he was very disappointed that his own legacy had led away from democracy and away from the kind of social democracy that he had envisioned toward this kind of neoliberal or state capitalism, whatever you want to call it, that you have this oligarchic, mafia-like corrupt system that you have, and this undemocratic, anti-democratic, and anti-Western, anti-liberal system and ideology that's now dominant in Russia. So though there are very few open statements by Gorbachev, and he was suffering from illness in the last few years of his life and was hospitalized for long periods, it's clear, it must be so, that he was extraordinarily disappointed and unhappy about the turn which his own very radical democratic reforms ultimately led to.
And finally, it was striking to me when you said you went to the Soviet Union for the first time in the 1960s and how you found a pretty conservative society. So I guess it's not so surprising then that Russia today is also characterized as a conservative society. It's not that Russia changed, it's that it was always there.
There was a deep conservative system there, that's true, through the Tsarist period and ultimately in Stalin's time and afterwards. But there were also radical and democratic and genuinely socialist elements as well. And they would appear now and then. If you actually take polls and ask Russians what they want, most Russians, let's say before the war with Ukraine, because this is a particular and bizarre and horrible moment that we're in now, in which a country is fighting a war in which they're learning only what the government wants them to know. But usually Russians would be for more democracy, more openness, more ability to travel to the West. And hopefully all of that, they hoped, would lead toward a richer, more prosperous life. Russians aren't that different from other people. They've had worse experiences than many other nations through repression and Stalinism and war. But let's not forget, these are the same people who won the Second World War in Europe, who lost 27 million people in that war, who defeated fascism, who liberated the death camps in Eastern Europe like Auschwitz and ended the Holocaust. It was the Soviet Union that made the world in 1945 safe for democracy and capitalism in the West. They didn't get to enjoy that for a very long time, and ultimately we have what we have today.
Ronald Suny has joined us for a conversation on the life and times of Mikhail Gorbachev, who has died at the age of 91. Ronald Suny is the William H. Sewell Jr. Distinguished University Professor of History at the University of Michigan. He's the author of a number of books, including Red Flag Wounded, Stalinism and the Fate of the Soviet Experiment, Stalin, Passages to Revolution, and They Can Live in the Desert but Nowhere Else, a history of the Armenian genocide. Professor Suny, as always, I've enjoyed our conversation, and I thank you.